Mark, how you doing today?
Good.
Thank you
Good to
very
be with
much
you,
for
Ryan.
coming on the show. I'm very excited to have you. We had a mutual contact that introduced us, and you guys have a nice little business peer group that I got to join, and found out
Yep.
that you yourself have gone through an exit. So I was pretty excited to have you on the show. And for our listeners' benefit, can you just bring us back to the day that you decided to become an entrepreneur and kind of what got you into it?
Ooh, the day I decided to become an entrepreneur. I guess the day I decided to become an entrepreneur is when I decided to go into private practice. So I'm a psychologist by training, and I was at the time I was working at the University of Minnesota Medical School in the Department of Family Practice, and I decided to launch into private practice because I didn't have an MD behind my name, and in medical school, MDs those are the folks that are making all the decisions, and I just saw that there would just be more opportunities um, for me in private practice. So, boy, that was back in the late '80s.
You had a unique subject specialty in your practice. You want to kind of give us some light into what was the focus that you had?
Yeah, the focus. I'm a psychologist by training, but my specialty area has been working in rehabilitation psychology, which is essentially working with people who have an injury or disability. So the type of patients I've worked with usually have some type of injury or medical condition or disability that's a major impact on their life, and I help them with their emotional, psychological adjustment as well as their vocational or career adjustment. Because often folks need to either augment, change their career, sometimes totally change out what they're doing work-wise.
And what
And
are some of the disabilities? Because I know there's kind of a wide range, isn't there?
oh yeah, it ranges from severely physically disabled folks. I work with people with spinal cord injuries, paraplegics, quadriplegics. I work with people who have lost a limb, amputees, people with brain injuries, people who have experienced a stroke or burn. Um, and then there are more common work injuries are back and neck injuries. People that have had a bad back or bad neck and can't continue in something really physically demanding.
So
Uh,
what was like? I mean, when you're obviously being a psychologist, you've already got the blessing of patience and empathy. But what led you to get in? I mean, was it something to do with family or background or experience that led you to focus in and narrow in on this?
um, I've always been service oriented. Way back in high school and college, I got involved in service clubs. I've always wanted to be of assistance in helping people. Um, I did have, in hindsight now, I did have an older brother. My oldest brother had a football injury
Hmm.
and almost died from an aneurysm.
Oh my gosh.
And this is back, there's a lot of focus now on concussions and concussion management. Well, back in the '70s, there was none. And I think that really led to, having my eyes opened in terms of how an injury can impact an individual. And I didn't really put two and two together till several years later that's maybe how I got into the rehab field.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, that it probably affected your entire family.
Yeah, yeah, he ended up surviving, but drastically changed his trajectory in terms of his career. He went from being big man on campus to being an invalid for almost 6 months, and that was real eye opening. So
Yeah, I can only imagine. So you jumped into private practice, and I'm excited to kind of pick your brain on it because you're in the specialty of where there's a lot of where you're in the professional services realm where I've had some other people on the show where we talk about the challenges of having a professional services firm, whether you're an attorney, an accountant, or a consultant, or a psychologist like yourself. building a business can be complicated because you're layering other people that are doing billable times and such. And, you know, you ended up creating a business with, I think you said, is it 25 employees that you had at one point?
Yeah. Yeah. When I sold the business, it had 25 employees. Yeah.
So can you kind of walk us through the journey that you had from what was some of the ways that you were staffing out? What were the products and services that you were doing and as you were building this business?
Well, as I grew my private practice, and of course, there's a lot of good clinicians out there. There's a lot of good psychologists out there, but the key to having a successful private practice is to being able to market yourself and knowing how to develop relationships with referral sources that patients just don't magically end up in your office. And so I had some success at the beginning in terms of building relationships with referral sources. And I had gotten to the point, I remember clearly the conversation I had with my wife. I was getting so busy. I said, I remember having a conversation with her that went something like, I'm either going to have to start saying no to referrals, or I'm going to need to hire somebody to handle the overflow. And we were at a key point in our life with my son. I remember my son was 9 years old, and he's now just turned 30, so that was 21 years ago. And we decided that she would ramp down in her work and that I would ramp up and attempt to build a business, build a larger practice. And so I hired one employee, then I hired another, and things just kind of took off. And
that's awesome.
It was just, some of it was luck, being at the right place at the right time. But it was also willingness to kind of take on the risk, take on the office space, hire clerical staff that don't generate billable hours, taking on all those issues, providing health insurance to employees. Those are all big ticket items.
Well, and it's a lot different than just all of a sudden you're building a business and not necessarily just treating patients. It's a different kind of role than you probably assumed at the beginning.
Yes. And then I went beyond just treating patients and their recovery. We ended up developing relationships, ultimately developing sort of a national reputation with several large employers and insurance carriers to assist their employees and their claimants to return to work. And it ended up, it ended up being mind-boggling.
So did you guys have contracts then with those providers and those larger companies, or like what was the nature of the relationship? Like what was it structured like?
We would have with some of the larger ones, yes. With some of the larger insurance carriers, we did develop contracts. Others, it was more of a reputation and them discovering, that we did good work, and the end result was, our whole focus, the private practice went from being Raderstorf and Associates to Behavioral Medical Interventions, or BMI was the name of the company. People saw that if you referred cases to BMI, there was a good chance that the individual would recover and return back to work. So our focus was all in helping people return back to work, and our reputation got out there.
So when you're having that decision that conversation with your wife, I mean, what was it like? Because I mean that's a joint team decision, to have someone give up their career for the better of the family. I mean, like,
yeah.
What was that like?
Well, she was actually at that time, she was one working full time and carrying the benefits. I was working just 3 days a week in private practice. And so we had to switch. We had to make this change, and I think she was at a point in her career where she was ready to perhaps make a change herself. I was getting to the point where, yeah, I think that I was ready for an additional challenge. So the timing was right, and we just worked through it, and it was definitely a team effort. I couldn't I couldn't have done this without the support of my wife, all through the 15 plus years that I was growing the business. So
I think you and I have had a couple conversations about the role of a spouse a little bit, and I don't know if you got any 2 cents on that, because I've never really dove into that on the show before, but I think the spouse is such a huge asset to an entrepreneur because of how lonely it can be.
Yes, yeah. It's a really, as I reflect on, my marriage and my relationship with Linda and, her role in my success, it's a delicate balance to have, because it's important, I think, to share with your spouse, what's going on with the business, but you don't want to overload it or, have all your conversations when you're together about the business. And I think that there were times when I erred by spending too much time focused on the business and not enough time maybe on her life and or on the kids.
What would you have done differently?
I think I would have tried to take better care of myself, so to speak, in that one of the reasons why I got out was I found myself, as you build more and more and you take on more people. And when you get to a point where you have 25 employees, there's a lot of stress and worry around that. And being able to just kind of at the end of the day go home and turn it off and not spend so much time thinking about the business, but being more present for your kids. I try to be a very involved father in terms of volunteering and coaching and so forth, but I think there were times when I was at home but not really present at home.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more about drawing a limit with the business to saying, okay, my employees can handle this, or this customer, this issue can wait. Family's important. I think in retrospect, I wish I would have said no more often to the business demands versus the family demands.
That's a huge topic going around, like just being able to say no. Just
Mm-hmm.
not taking on more stuff. So when you're referring, you wish you would have taken better care of yourself. Are you referring to physically or mentally?
I would say mentally. I've taken pretty good care of myself physically. So I got into running marathons and still doing taking that on even at the age of 62.
You're 62? No kidding.
Yeah.
You look really good for 62.
Well, thank you. I've tried to take care of myself physically. It's more saying no to some of the demands, and it's in hindsight I can see that the business can just gobble you up if you let it. The demands of the business, and you've got to draw a line somewhere where to say, okay, I've done what I can here. I've done my best today, and I'm gonna go home and turn it off. And as I was growing my business, I looked for mentors, and I tried to find people that could give me some guidance. And it's very rare that I found a business owner that had good balance in their life.
That's the truth. I would agree with that wholeheartedly.
Yeah, it's a never-ending open pit to pour your energy into if you want. There's always things that you can do to grow your business, and that's where you got to be able to pull out of it and enjoy your family and enjoy life.
So as you were growing the business, did you? Because I agree. When you said it's an endless pit of energy that you can devote to it, was there some? I think every entrepreneur's got it in their head. Whether is it revenue or size or deals that you were trying to close? Like, what was the driving force for the metrics, or was it just deal flow because of your reputation?
What was a driving force?
Of that, was there certain achievements you were trying to hit with, like, milestones in the business?
No, not really, not really. And in retrospect, now that I'm 5 years removed from owning the business, what I ended up, how I got to the point where I decided I wanted to sell my business is, about the time I turned 50, I started asking questions of myself like, is this what I want to do the rest of my life? I've got this nice little business. It provides for a good income. It continues to grow. And I found myself spending more and more energy on managing people, managing customers, dealing with customer complaints, dealing with employee complaints, and less impacting the daily lives of people, which is, frankly, one of the reasons why I went into psychology and went into the rehab field, is to try to, in a small way, maybe impact people's lives. And so I decided, probably 10 years ago, 2007, 2008, that, I think I want to move on and I want to do something different, that I still was young enough that I could still, have another career, or a second career, if you want to call it. And so that's when I decided to get the business ready to sell. And it took 2 or 3 years to get it ready. And fortunately, I was able to execute it, and it sold at the end of 2010. And then I stayed on for 6 months, and I was out by 2011. And my wife and I went off to Ecuador and had a wonderful sabbatical in Ecuador for 7 months.
That's fantastic. So you make it sound super easy, huh? I want to unpack it, because your time frame of 2 to 3 years. I just want to kind of walk through some of the steps that you did. So where was the first place you turned when you said got it ready for sale? What are some of the things that you did as you were doing this?
Well, I started being, you've probably heard this, but the value of your company is inversely proportional to how important it is that you run the company. Mm-hmm. And so I knew that if I continued to be, the figurehead of the company, that the value of the company and the marketability of the company was not going to be as great. So I brought in 2 key employees.
Where did you find
them? One was a friend. The other was I just posted an ad in the paper, and she was a nurse who worked at Alina, and I offered her a package that included equity, and I ended up having 4 shareholders come on board.
Okay.
And that was one of the first key steps in the service business. Is I think I realized that if you want to have good people be on your team, you either have to compensate them very, very well, or you have to give them a piece of the pie. And I ended up having 2 doctors, 2 physicians, 1 nurse, and 1 psychologist become shareholders. And their piece of the pie was really small in the grand scheme of things. The 4 of them, I think their equity was equaled 10%. So
so not much then, yeah.
Yeah, I ended up owning 90% of the company, and they owned 10%. But I tell you, it really created a loyalty and a commitment. It was a really good two-way agreement, I think.
So how did you get the business valued as you were just, like how are you quantifying that for them, and like how did you vest it, and what was kind of the makeup of the agreements?
Yeah, well, I ended up. It was sweat equity, so they would put in billable hours, and in return, in lieu of being paid, they would get a certain percent, and the agreements were all maxed out at a certain level, and all of them were very agreeable to doing that. I'm sorry, what was your other question? It was
Well, because I think you kind of answered it, but how did you value it at the same time? So they were vesting or using sweat
yeah,
equity, but what was the kind of the how
yeah.
the
I ended up having a CFO consultant. I hired a gentleman who was instrumental in helping me be successful in selling the business. And of course, I'm sure you hear this. You surround yourself by people that have expertise that you don't have. And he ended up evaluating the company and determining sort of a fair value.
got it.
And my shareholders didn't have any issues with it. I mean, you try to be fair about it.
Mm-hmm. Did they know what the plan was?
I They knew that selling the business, yes, they knew that selling the business was going to be the exit plan. Now, when that was going to happen, how it was going to happen, I ended up selling the business, privately. I didn't go to a broker, and I didn't put it out on the free market, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I probably picked the worst time to try to push forward with selling it, because it was right after the financial downturn in 2008, 2009, that I had my first nibble. It was a private equity group out of Boston, and that ended up going nowhere. And boy, that was a lot. That was a lot of wasted time and energy.
I've heard the stories.
But I shouldn't say it wasn't wasted. No, I learned. It was disappointing that I spent so much time and effort, and that it never came to fruition. But boy, I learned a lot in that process.
How did you end up meeting them if you were not working with a broker?
It was an industry specialty. One of our partners had gotten bought by this private equity firm.
Got it.
And I privately let them know that I was open to selling, and so the president of our partner let the private equity firm know about it, and we had discussions.
What was some of the biggest things that you learned out of that whole experience?
I go back to show me the money, because ultimately they didn't have authority. That's what killed the deal, is they didn't have authority to come up with the money to buy the business. And I should have asked more. I should have asked more questions about their financial situation, versus it being really one-sided about them asking about my financial situation. I mean, we continued to grow through the economic downturn. We ended up having, I think, a 25% growth in 2008, 2009, which I think in retrospect was pretty impressive. And so they could see the growth, but they ended up, at least that's what I was told, is that they couldn't come up with the funding for it. So
Interesting.
yeah.
That's I mean, that's a whole long conversation itself, because the private equity route, usually, like, the stats are that the private equity firms that talk directly to an owner end up getting like 1 or 2 multiples less. But then you don't know where they're getting their money, what kind of, whether it's from pension funds or from large institutions or affluent individuals, or whether they have the money now or later. Was it one of the things where they would have to go raise it once they got the approval or something?
Yeah. I didn't know all the deals about it, or all the details about it, and this is where my lack of financial knowledge, came into play. And I just think it's important to, if you have a suitor, just make sure that they have the money they say they have to buy it, and don't go down a long trail with them only to be disappointed.
How much time did you spend throughout that whole process?
mm, it was about a year,
Oh
and
man.
yeah, and what as I look back in retrospect, it is very stressful trying to sell your company. Um, I made a decision, and I don't. I guess I don't have any regrets. I think I'd do this again, but I made a decision to keep this quiet and to not share it with my employees.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very selective about who I talked to about it. Obviously, my shareholders knew about it. My wife knew about it. Close friends and confidants knew about it, but I didn't share it at all with my employees, and that can be very stressful.
I just knowing you, I can probably imagine that you're a very open and transparent individual. And
Yeah.
what I struggled with when we were going through that is, here I am with my family and friends, and half of them are like my best friends, and don't you just kind of feel like you're cheating on them for some
Yeah.
reason?
Yeah. And I felt some guilt after executing the sale and announcing to them the sale of the business. There were some that were just pissed. They were mad,
Yeah.
And, to me, it's the happiest day of my life, and here you have these dedicated employees that are mad at you, and so it's a mixed bag. It's
Mm-hmm.
my worry was that they would, if they got wind of it, that they'd start looking, and I realized that when you're selling a service business, you're essentially selling a group of people that work together, that provide a good service, and the suitor is buying a group of people, and they're the key asset, and so I don't think I'd do it any differently, but I guess I would.
What did you do with those people that were like, as you're passing? Well, first of all, I got two questions about that. Is, how did you make sure that they stayed and were happy with the decision? Because I'm assuming some part of your payout was affected by that. But then also, before you answer that, kind of how, let's go back to the, you get done with this whole distraction with the private equity route. Where did you go to the next step to find this eventual acquirer?
Well, after the disappointment with the private equity group, I said, okay, I'm gonna shelve this for at least 6 months and just get back to focusing on growing the business. And then another suitor came knocking, like in the next 2 months, 3 months later. And this was another partner of ours. And again, I had a very private conversation. He approached me and said, "Mark, I really like your company. Are you interested in selling?" And I said, "Well, yeah, if it's at the right price,
Right.
I would." And then that took another year before we executed that.
When you say partner, is that like one of your customers or another, like a complementary firm or what?
Well, yeah. So this was a firm out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I can talk openly about it because they ended up buying it. So they specialized in dealing with traumatic events in the workplace. So whenever you hear of a violent incident in the workplace or a shooting in the workplace, they respond within 24 hours and send in counselors to help with traumatic stress debriefings.
Got it.
And what they were missing was a service to help people come back to work or to help them return back to work.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a natural bridge or a natural complement to their services. And so this company called Crisis Care Network ended up buying BMI. And 5 years later, they're doing quite well. They've doubled the size of the company, and they just moved into a nice new building on 494. They rebranded. They're now called R3 Continuum. And I went to their open house last week, and they've got some really nice offices. It's right next to the Vikings training facility, and you can see the signage on the building. They've done quite well, and so I'm happy for them, and I'm happy for my employees that are still with them, that they're now on to bigger and better challenges in their career.
That's a good feeling, isn't it? And so
Mm-hmm.
let's go back to my second question. So you got a year. I'm assuming that you're lots of due diligence, or like what was like, kind of walk us through, like, how did you value it? What were the terms that you were kind of seeking out, or like how, like,
Yeah.
we don't have to disclose any of the fine details, but there's a lot of earnouts that are in the space that you're kind of in, or different conditions that are usually involved in the deal.
Yeah. So what I ended up doing, and I advise this to other people in this situation that are looking at selling, is figuring out what your number is. What is your number that you want to achieve in your business? And then once you get that number, get out. I say that with having some hindsight now, looking in the rearview mirror. My wife and I have said on many occasions, we traded time for money. We could have easily held on to this business and probably sold it for, today for twice of what I got for it 5 years ago. But we decided that we wanted to spend this time doing other things, and we've done a lot of wonderful things. And so I think it's important that you set the bar, and then once you get there, try to execute the deal. Mm-hmm. So in my situation, my CFO advised what he thought was reasonable. The company continued to grow while in the year that I was negotiating. And ironically, in the 11th hour, my CFO consultant, who I really value his opinion, he said to me, Mark, you should not sell this. This is too low of a price. You should hang on to this, and look at selling another year or two from now. And I looked at Craig and I said, Craig, I'm ready to move on. I'm happy with where I'm at. This is enough. So I went against the advice of my CFO and executed the deal because we were ready to. My wife and I were ready to move on to other things.
Well, and I've been through the exact situation when you emotionally flip flop between selling, not selling, selling, not selling. Mm-hmm. At some point, the money doesn't matter because the emotional toll it takes on you, and like your focus is hard to quantify.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and so the parameters of the deal were, I think he paid 40% up front, and then 60% was paid over 5 years. So he had payments over 5 years, and
was there any kind of, this kind of goes back to that original question I had about the employees. Was there like a promissory note where it was just guaranteed, or was there kind of retention of staff and billable time, or?
Yeah, no, there wasn't any contingency, based on staff. No, it was 40% up front, and then payments over 5 years. I ended up staying on for 6 months after executing, and was on salary, and I think that was one of the hardest periods for me.
What was hard about it?
Having the title president and not having any authority, and my employees coming to me saying, they're changing this benefit, and they're changing the vacation plan, and this isn't fair, Mark, and I had no authority. I think that once you sell, the quicker you can get out, the less stressful it is.
For you and everybody, probably.
Yeah. And frankly, it wasn't until I went off to Ecuador that I could really turn it off, because even after the new president came in, she ended up and this is me not being good with maybe limit setting, but she wanted my advice, and I tried to help her. And it wasn't until I went off to Ecuador, where you had limited cell
Mm-hmm.
phone coverage and limited internet coverage, that I could really step away.
So was that plan, as you're emotionally, you got to have like probably 1.5 feet out the door as you're thinking about what's next. I mean, when you decided to like stay on, did you already have that 6 months, and did you have the Ecuador trip planned, or like where did like all those pieces fall in, or were you just like, we got to get out of here, and you had a place in mind?
Yes, we had thought about Ecuador way back when the private equity firm was courting us. And so that was our goal. Was my wife teaches at Normandale Community College. She was able to get a sabbatical. The youngest of my three kids went off to college, and my daughter Jenna gave us a blessing to go to Ecuador. And so we that was our grand plan, was to sell the business and take the sabbatical to Ecuador, and then spend that time figuring out what we wanted to do with the next stage of our life. So
Walk us through those conversations, because when I was chatting with you and your group, and as I had mentioned, a lot of the owners, people I've talked to on the show, where that's the hardest part. Once you get the money, it's like, what do you do now that you don't have all of these people knocking on your door to solve their problems? You know, like, what's the internal dialogue that you and your wife are having?
yeah, well, so I think it's I'll try to answer that question, and direct me if I'm not hitting the mark here. But I advise people, and some of what I'm doing now, I'm working 3 days a week in private practice, but I do some counseling with people who are of my generation, or baby boomers who are looking for their encore career, so to speak. I think the more time that and energy you can spend on what's next around the corner, the better the adjustment's going to be. But it's a tricky thing. It's because it's really hard when you're getting ready to sell a business, because all of your focus is on getting the business ready. Is it going to happen? The negotiations. It's a very stressful time, and it's important not to get too far down the road, because I did get too far down the road with a private equity company, and that fell apart. But it's also important to talk through. Okay, what are we going to do once we get out of this the business? And I ended up spending probably a year, kind of figuring that out after I got back from Ecuador.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very happy with my life now.
Did it take you a while to adjust?
Yes, it did.
What were some of the hardest parts about the adjustment?
Um, you go from being a big fish in a little pond to being a little fish in a big pond, essentially. You end up going from where when you're in an industry and everybody knows you, and your employees know you, and your partners and so forth. And then suddenly there's this whole new world out there. It's like, God, where do I spend my time? Where do I focus my energy? Uh, there's so many choices out there, and I ended up exploring the nonprofit space for a while, thinking that maybe I could be an executive director for a nonprofit, but I quickly found that there weren't that many opportunities. And I really wanted to focus on serving kids, or being working with kids at risk. And I figured out that I could work 3 days a week in private practice, and then volunteer 2 days a week in the schools, and still have that impact. So that's what my life is now: 3 days a week private practice, and volunteering the other 2 days a week.
It's an awesome story, and I thank you for sharing it, because I think hearing someone that's gone through the transition, and it's definitely not a smooth road, but you were able to kind of unwind it, and like you said, finding the perfect balance is, I think, the whole key. You
Yeah.
nailed it.
Yeah.
Mark, what is the best way for our listeners to get in touch with you?
Um, I think just either by email or at my office. So I'm in St. Louis Park, and my email is mark at raderstorfassociates.com. So that's my last name spelled Raderstorf associates plural.com. Or our clinic number is 612 823 5187.
Mark, I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Sure. Well, Ryan, thanks for having me. I really haven't talked to somebody like this since I exited, so it's kind of fun to recall the journey.
Well, it's great to be able to have someone that can share it too, because the whole point with our listeners is hearing it from people that have been there, so that way it doesn't feel like the first and only time when you go through it eventually.
Yes, and I'm really glad to help other people out there. I learned a few things, so I'm very glad to help other folks that may be in the same boat, because we all need mentors. We all need people to help us get down the road.
Well, thanks again, Mark.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me.